Hi, we're Josh
and Ariel Wamsley,
owners of Green Valley Tree LLC, based in North Windham.
We're proud to sponsor Connecticut East this week and to serve the communities of Windham and New London counties with our tree removal and plant healthcare services.
Visit our website at greenvalleytreeworks.com for a full list of our services or give us a call on 860-234-4041. We look forward to hearing from you.
Wholly inadequate, what many are saying about Eversource's response after Tropical Storm Isaias. Protesting the Mayor of New London, Mike Passero speaks to us about a recent rally held outside City Hall, plus a look at some other stories from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. It's hurricane season, and even though Connecticut didn't experience a hurricane recently, Tropical Storm Isaias still brought damage to the state, leaving almost 900,000 people with no power, some for over a week. Eversource, the largest energy company in the state with the largest customer base, responded, but it was quickly overwhelmed due to what many are saying was a severe underestimation by the company in the storm. Since then, legislators, city leaders and customers are calling for Eversource to be investigated, and the governor has requested the state's Public Utility Regulatory Authority, or PURA, to do just that. I caught up with the chair of PURA via Zoom and began by asking what powers and responsibilities PURA has.
PURA is a small state agency. We're a quasi-judicial branch, which means that you can think of PURA a lot like a court system. All of the decisions that we make are legally binding and appealable to the Superior Court. So what we do at PURA, we're statutorily charged with regulating the rates and services of our public service utilities that are in the electricity, gas, water, and some limited jurisdiction over the telecom industry still. So what we do in the regulation is we're bound to balance the public's right to a safe, adequate, and reliable service at reasonable rates with providers' a legal right to a reasonable return on its investment. So you can think of myself and my two colleagues, the other two commissioners, as judges, and we have evidentiary proceedings in which parties come before us and discuss all the issues that go into running a public service utility.
Can PURA actually act alone without the request from, say, the governor or other bodies if there is a concern or dispute, or does it have to wait to be asked?
We can initiate an investigation on our own, and in fact, that's something that I've done quite a lot of since coming to PURA last year. Historically, agencies like PURA, there's a PURA equivalent in all the states across the country. Historically, commissions are much more of a passive or reactive body. The phrase of being a Monday morning quarterback, for example, that is almost exactly what a commission is tasked with doing. We're coming behind folks and saying, did you do that correctly? I think in today's age, as customers need the grid for more of our day-to-day activities, there's a lot of pressure on economic regulators like myself to transition the culture of statutory agencies like PURA to become more of an active, take more of an active role rather than the passive role. So that's been a focus of mine over the past year since starting at PURA, and we definitely have that authority to act alone. Certainly, we take input from the governor and the General Assembly on areas that we should be paying particular attention to.
Today, of course, we're talking about Eversource, the recent storms which hit Connecticut and other parts of the Northeast, which crippled the electricity supply and left a lot of people in the dark for many, many days. I understand that Eversource and public utilities have to submit a storm impact plan or a pre-event plan to organizations like PURA. What's your responsibility here with that once they submit it? Is it a case of you just basically dot the I's and cross the T's, or can you actually challenge them about, what it is they're planning to do?
It's a great question. So in advance of major weather events, which can be classified using a state set of guidelines as a level 5 through a level 1 event, depending on the severity. Eversource and UI are both required to file a pre-staging memo with PURA that gives us some insight into the number of crews that they are staging in advance of the weather event, corresponding to their prediction of what the outages are going to be on their system. Those pre-staging memos are filed usually anywhere between 24 and 72 hours in advance of the major weather event. They're filed with us so that we have initial insight into their planning and can hold them accountable against their projections for what the storm is going to be like. It's not, at that point, it's not an option available to PURA to get in the business of managing them at that point. They have executives that are well compensated for managing the day-to-day operations of that utility. Rather, our role is to hold them accountable to the projections that were provided to us in that memo, which is what we announced we were going to do in the investigation that was announced just last week.
I know you can't go into specific details about the investigation, but can you give us a rough idea of how long you expect that investigation may be, to take? And I think there's a suggestion that maybe there will be a possible hearing as well. Is that also correct?
That is correct. So there is a statute, 1632E, I believe, that defines how PURA must investigate the Eversource and UI following a major storm event. There's no specific timeline specified by statute, but I have instructed my staff that we need to take this investigation as a priority matter for us, and I would hope to issue a schedule for that by the end of this week and look to have that investigation concluded by the end of this calendar year. Certainly, we have some initial ideas, about what went wrong, along with what could be done to improve the situation. So I want to assure folks that just because the investigation is proceeding on one timeline doesn't mean that we're not simultaneously looking at ways to mandate the utility response improve in the interim. Those will occur on parallel paths. The improvement plans have actually been on a path since I started last year. Some of those responses to our request for proposals came in on July 31st. So lots of work underway. There will definitely be hearings as part of the investigation. I would imagine upwards of 1 to 2 weeks worth of hearings and opportunity for public comment during that process.
Can you give us a bit of an idea of what sort of recommendations about Eversource that PURA can make, and how binding are those recommendations?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, PURA is a quasi-judicial agency. So when we make a decision, it is binding on Eversource. It's legally binding. If Eversource doesn't like our decision, then they have to appeal it to Superior Court. I think the nuance here that I would like folks to understand is when PURA makes a binding decision on the utility, it has some legal ramifications for the cost recovery space. So, there are things, for example, going on right now where customers might be wondering, well, why isn't PURA telling Eversource and UI right now that they should be reimbursing customers for food spoilage and medication spoilage? And the answer to that question is anytime PURA mandates something, that translates into the legal right for the utility to seek cost recovery for things associated with that. So while, of course, I think that the utilities should be, owning up to what they've done wrong and voluntarily compensating customers, the last thing I want to do is give the utilities an excuse to then try to recover that compensation in rate. So I know I'm starting to get a little into the weeds there, but hopefully that explains some of what's going on over the past week.
The other thing I want to ask just on that is they have been penalised in the past. I mean, obviously, Eversource and public utilities do get penalised by regulatory bodies like you. What actually happens to that penalty money? Where does that go?
Sure. Under the civil penalty statute that PURA operates under, it prohibits Eversource or UI or whichever company is being fined by PURA, it prohibits them from recovering those fines from ratepayers. So the fines are collected and paid for by their shareholders. And then currently, those fines are directed into the general fund. That is a slightly different practice than the state that I came from. Moving to Connecticut, states across the country usually empower their regulatory authority to return those fines in the form of, energy assistance grants or bill credits to customers. So that's something that I think we can work on with our legislators to see if that is, a more preferred path forward.
Now, it's been stated time and again that Connecticut pays the highest prices in the nation for its electricity. PURA obviously does overview any rate increases that are requested by public utilities. Is there anything more that PURA can do? Because clearly the storm has brought up this issue again, but obviously just before the storm, there was a hike in delivery rate prices by Eversource, and clearly people aren't happy.
Oh, I think that's the understatement of the year, right? I know for certain people aren't happy. I also understand that the price per kilowatt hour that Connecticut pays for electricity is the highest in the nation. If you look back at speeches I've been making over the past year, that has been a common theme of mine in trying to start that conversation. The energy landscape in Connecticut is without a doubt broken. And what I announced last October was an equitable modern grid proceeding. From my perspective, if we're going to continue to pay the highest rates in the country, then we very well should be delivering the value that customers would demand. For paying something, for paying an exorbitant rate, you expect a value for what you're paying for. So that equitable modern grid proceeding that I'm referencing, that has 11 different tracks and is looking at different ways in which we can attract third parties and private capital that begin empowering customers, not just residential, but also our commercial and industrial customers, empowering them to take over a more active ownership role in their energy service, whether it's, going off the grid through battery storage and solar on their homes, speeding up interconnections, embracing electric vehicles. There are a lot of different options for taking the power back from the major utilities, if you would excuse the pun. And that is underway. Those proposals for the first round of that proceeding came in July 31st. So I think you'll see PURA try to accelerate some of those investigations as an avenue for folks to see a path forward other than continued monopoly from Eversource and UI.
And that's a point I was about to make to you as well. It does seem that it is a monopoly by, obviously, Eversource. They seem to have the largest number of customers here in the state. But also what is of interest here in Connecticut, and I'm sure this is reflected as well in other states, is there are smaller power companies. Off the top of my head, Norwich Public Utilities comes to mind, Groton Utilities here, both in eastern Connecticut. Do you think it is a case that maybe the whole monopolization of electricity in Connecticut needs to be reviewed, and possibly Eversource, stripped of some of that monopoly, and maybe more of these smaller companies created, which do seem to have more capability and understand obviously local requirements better?
It is certainly something that should be on the table in terms of looking at other models, whether it's large electric cooperatives, whether it's creating a power authority like New York has, which is, a publicly owned utility. There are lots of different options, and frankly, they should all be on the table.
Marissa Gilbert, Chair of PURA, ever so many thanks for joining us and for clarifying those points as well for us on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Since the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, there have been protests and rallies across the country and the world. In New London, the activist group Hearing Youth Voices have held several rallies and recently descended on City Hall, demanding the Mayor Mike Passero come out and speak to the people. It took a while for the mayor to come out to the crowd, and I spoke to Mayor Passero about the situation. We're talking about a protest that occurred outside City Hall fairly recently. Tell us a little bit about it, because ultimately you came out and, as you do, you spoke to, obviously, the protesters and listened to what they had to say. But was it all a bit of a surprise?
Yes, it was. Not sure whether I should have got caught by surprise, but I did. We had a promotional ceremony in the fire department at fire headquarters late Friday afternoon, and that was a great gathering. Actually, we promoted an 8 or 9 year member of the department. It's always great to see a young person advancing in their career and to recognize their dedication to the department. But he also happened to be the first firefighter of color that has been promoted to lieutenant in probably about 2 decades, I think. So it was a milestone for our department, which has become a much more diverse over the last few years with our hiring program. So we're very proud of that. But I did have a number of phone calls and other business on still backed up for that day. So I got back to City Hall, and at one point, late in the day, after after everybody else in the building had left, there was one employee from the planning department on the second floor that came upstairs. And when he opened the door, I realized there was a protest outside, because you could just hear the noise and the yelling, and it was quite interesting. My first experience of that as mayor.
The media report suggested there was around about 75 people around City Hall. That must be quite a daunting thing, though, to be faced by people who were calling your name and asking you to come out of the building.
I don't see any problem with that. And when I went out, it was actually a pretty lively discussion, and I'm not sure we had a meeting. I know we didn't have a meeting of the minds on our opinions about strategy, but my problem was just the fact that I was on a really important phone call that I was not able to interrupt. So I had to wait until that call was over before I could get outside. And it seemed to, judging by the employee that was still in the building that kept checking in, can you get out? Can you get out? Because he was nervous that the crowd was getting upset that I was not responding. But it wasn't possible. And the unfairness of the situation is, if the organizers of that, who have a relationship with me, had merely put me on notice and said, look, we're going to need you at 5:30, or we're going to be there at 6 o'clock, or whatever time it was, I could have arranged my schedule to make sure that I was not tied up. So that's unfortunate, but and then it's not helpful, the rhetoric that if they accuse me of hiding in City Hall, because everybody that knows, I have a track record now. I've been in office for over 4 years, and I'm very available. I got outside as soon as I could, and the discussion lasted for quite a long while. I would say well over an hour, maybe closer to 2 hours. I'm not exactly sure, because it was pretty intense. I took the questions and responded the best I could. There was a lot of emotion in the crowd. There's a lot of, young people who think that, and rightly so, that, our governments on the local level, on the state level, on the national level, have taken too long to respond to the issues that the Black Lives Movement are raising right now. And I think our governments, well, I can't speak for the feds, but I can certainly speak locally, and to a certain extent at the state, but definitely locally, we're ready to respond. We're ready. I don't think there's a goal of the movement that the city isn't in lockstep on trying to find ways to achieve as quickly as possible.
The whole point of this protest was calling for the defunding of police. Before we get into that, of course, just recently the state signed a police accountability bill into law, which means cities like New London will now be guided by this particular bill. So will that be helpful, do you feel, in this continuing discussion that obviously the protesters want to have with you about defunding the police, which you've said time and again that's not possible, and there are reasons why that cannot be done?
When I say that's not possible, I'm talking only about the budgeting in the city of New London. I'm not talking about the movement or the goals of the movement, which I on the whole, agree with. The police accountability bill that passed the state legislature, I think it will be helpful. We're still digesting all of the parts of it. It's quite a large bill, but I don't know. I'm not aware of any particular section of it that will not be helpful. Our ability to govern locally comes from the state and enabling legislation. So the enabling legislation that they've given us, they've given the municipalities in that bill, will just empower us to be able to continue our work in ensuring that our local police department is responsive to the community and that we build or design the method that we police our city, and it's consistent with what our community wants. So there are specific issues about how we've been doing that the young people in New London are pointing out to us that they're not happy about. The SRO issue, that's school resource officers, having armed uniformed police in our schools. In reality, in New London, there's only one. That's all the school district could afford, and they're rethinking that. That particular policy issue as to whether there should be a police resource officer is a decision that's vested with the Board of Education and the school administration. I'm following that debate, and the city's willing to certainly. That officer is a member of the New London Police Department, and we could use those resources back on the city side if they decide there's a better way to do it in the schools, to provide the services that the SRO provides in another manner. So that's an interesting debate.
Let me just pick up very quickly about, obviously, the budget for New London Police. If I'm correct, it's about a third of the overall city budget, $12.1 million, is actually given over to the police. It seems a lot of money. Is it?
The budget it's not a third of what the taxpayers contribute to the budget of New London. So actually, half of the taxpayer-funded portion of the budget goes to education, and the other half is then split up amongst all of the departments of the city. And if you look at the pie that way, it's well short of one-third. We wouldn't be able to run all our other departments. So generally, when you're looking at the taxpayer-funded portion of our budget, which is what controls the tax rate in the city, which is what controls, the mill rate, then off the top of my head, I don't know what percentage of it is, but I can tell you that we take that the half of the pie that's left, and we try to equitably divide those resources amongst all the other city services, Public Works, the fire department, EMS, the police department. Yes, human services. We've been ramping up our spending on human services over the last 4 years, which is one of the things that the movement is calling for. We started that process 4 years ago. The city had no presence whatsoever in the delivery of human services or resources or coordination with all of our social service agencies, and we're the hub of this greater metropolitan area. So all of the people that need any kind of social services come to New London for those social services. So whether it's opioid use disorder, whether it's reentry services, whether it's mental health services, whether it's domestic violence services, any of the broad, dealing with food insecurity in the region. The city of New London manages all of that, but we had no government official or government department that helped to organize all of these social services. So we've been putting more resources into doing that and we don't provide direct services, but you certainly have to coordinate with the municipal government in order to have effective delivery of all services. That's another thing that we're putting revenue into. So we divide the pie, but when you come out in the end, every department ends up under-resourced, including the police department. So in my view, to a certain extent in New London, if we just look at New London, which is important in this debate, we have already been defunding our police department. I think what we have to focus the discussion on in New London is how we are allocating those already scarce resources and how we're doing our job as far as policing goes. Because part of the human condition is never being able to do things perfectly, but always striving to improve. And that's why I'm more than willing to hear from our young people, to understand what their concerns are, and to try to explain to them why taking money away from that agency will actually hinder their ability to achieve the goals that they're after. Under-resourcing that agency more will only complicate the real issues that they're trying to bring attention to.
Green Valley Tree LLC is proud to sponsor Connecticut East this week. Contact Green Valley Tree LLC for all your tree removal and plant health care needs and more. Find us at greenvalleytreeworks.com or call 860-234-4041.
Time now for a look at some of the other stories making the headlines in the region recently. In the day this week, U.S. Representative Joe Courtney announced recently more than $850,000 in federal funding for fire departments across eastern Connecticut, including New London, Groton and Norwich. In the Middletown Press this week, in East Haddam, Goodspeed Musicals is holding outdoor concerts themed Goodspeed by the River on the Goodspeed lawn overlooking the scenic Connecticut River. Guests are invited to pack a picnic basket and lawn chairs and bring the family for a safe, fun evening. And in the Chronicle this week, the University of Connecticut announced out-of-state students enrolled only in online courses will not be allowed to live in university housing this fall. In recent communications with the State Department of Public Health and our own infectious disease experts at UConn Health, we have come to the difficult conclusion that we need to further de-densify our campus residential spaces, UConn President Thomas Katsoulias said in a letter to the UConn community. And the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station's mosquito management program has detected the first mosquitoes with the EEE virus in Stonington. Dr. Philip Armstrong heads up the program.
One of the concerns is the fact that we're detecting it so early in the season. So typically with EEE virus, it emerges, if at all, later in August. And so the fact that we're detecting it this early is cause for concern.
Last year, EEE was detected in 28 Connecticut communities, mainly in eastern Connecticut, with 4 confirmed human cases and 3 fatalities. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East, where you can also listen to the show again on demand. And please like, follow and share on your social media platforms too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.